How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? And how many times must cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The first time this song was ever sung publicly was April the 16th, 1962, at a folk music festival at a place called Gertie's Music City. It was sung by a 21-year-old songwriter named Robert Allen Zimmerman. You may know him as Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan only sang 2 stanzas of the song, Blowin' in the Wind, the first time he sang it, but he came up with a 3rd stanza that he inserted in the middle of the song, and this is the 3rd stanza he added to Blowin' in the Wind. He says, "Yes, and how many years must a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? And how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? Yes, and how many times can a man turn his head and say and pretend that he just doesn't see?" The answer, my friend, as Bobby Dylan would say it, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Now, this song was taken by his manager and given to another group that he managed in the summer of 1963. It was a folk trio named Peter, Paul, and Mary. They recorded Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind and released it as what at the time was a 45 RPM single record. It was released in the middle of July of 1963, and in the first week that it was in stores, it sold 300,000 copies. By mid-August, it had been certified as a platinum record, meaning it had sold over 1 million copies. As the songwriter, Bob Dylan was given a royalty for over 1 million songs that had been sold of the song that he wrote, and that royalty totaled $5,000. In 2004, Rolling Stone magazine put together a list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. Blowin' in the Wind was number 15. Now, it has been said that if you can remember the 1960s, you weren't there. But if you can remember the 60s, or if you survived the 1960s, or if you are like I am, in your 60s and you can barely remember the 60s, the reality is that the 60s was a time of great turmoil. It was a time not dissimilar to the day that we live in, a time of great public rhetoric. And what Bob Dylan and other artists and musicians did in that time was they gave a soundtrack. They created an anthem for a generation. You see, I believe that true transformation does not simply happen when we change our minds. True transformation requires more than understanding. It also requires feeling and doing. And it's the artists, it's the poets, it's the playwrights, it's the people who define our culture emotionally, who just define our culture artistically, that move a culture toward true transformation. 1900 years before Bob Dylan, in the center of the intellectual Western world, the city of Athens, Greece, in February of 51 AD, a young converted rabbi named Saul of Tarsus stood in the cradle of Western civilization, at the epicenter of academia of the Western world, in the center of Athens, in the public forum called the Areopagus. And it was there that the Apostle Paul made his case for his passion, the gospel story of Jesus of Nazareth. And his appeal was built on two propositions. The first one was that all children are God's children. And his second proposition was that all truth is God's truth. As the Apostle Paul stood in front of the collected thought leaders and the intellectual elite of his day, he said this. He said that the God who made the earth and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. And he is not, this God is not a God who dwells or who lives in temples made of stone built by human hands. And this God is not served by human hands like he needs anything at all. Rather, this God is the God who he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. See, the God that I'm talking about is the God who, through one man, made all the nations. The people would inhabit the entire earth. And this God marked out for each one of us, for all of mankind, the appointed times of our own history and the boundaries of the lands and the places where we should live. And God did this for one reason, that we might seek him and perhaps even reach out for God and find God. Because the truth is that God is not far from any single one of us. It's as you know that in him we live and breathe and have our being. Because it's as the ancient Greek poets and popular writers have said, we are his offspring. In the Areopagus in February of 51 AD, the Apostle Paul was giving more than a rhetorical speech. He was arguing from more than logic or rational thought. He was giving an apologia. Apologia is something that is beyond logic, from logic, built on logic, more than reason, more than rational thought. Paul was arguing with his whole being. Paul was not just aiming at their minds. He was aiming at their hearts. And today I want to wander around in what Paul was saying there in the Areopagus and see if we can't feel what he was challenging them to feel. But before we look at that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to help us to feel you all around us, right beside us, going before us and standing with us and within us. Pray that we would experience you today in our heart and our mind and our soul. Pray that for myself, and for my family, and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I am not an expert in persuasive speech. I am not, I don't consider myself to be a highly persuasive person. I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher, I'm a Bible teacher, I'm a storyteller. And I know I'm hilarious, I know that. And really, you don't understand how difficult it is for me week after week to kind of rein in that hilarity, to keep it in check, to keep this whole event from turning into just a stand-up comedy routine. And I appreciate those of you who say to me regularly, Dave, you are not as funny as you think you are. My wife is leading that group because she goes out of her way to remind me, Dave, that's not that funny. She tells me that all the time, but I know better. But while I may not be an expert in persuasive speech, I really do think I understand what it takes to persuade me to change my mind, to change my behavior, to change how I feel about something. And if you really want to be persuasive with me, I think you need to address three things. First of all, you need to address my mind. You need to make sense. You need to be logical. You need to be rational. You need to give me facts and data, not just your opinion, not just your perspective, but give me genuine, truth information. The second thing you need to do is I need to feel something. I need to connect with this at an emotional level. You do that with illustrations or anecdotes or by telling me stories and help me understand how you feel about what you're trying to convince me of. Let me engage at an emotional level. I have to engage my mind and I have to engage my heart. And the third way that you can convince me to believe what you're trying to get me to believe is to show me how. What does it mean? What do I do? Give me a checklist. Give me to-do lists of things that I can do. Give me a list of the 5 things that I can do to be a better leader. Give me a list of the 50 things that I can do to be a better husband. Give me a list of the 1,000 things that I can do to be a better man, and that will help me. You see, it's just like you have to speak to all of me. Don't just speak to part of me. Because true transformation is not just changing our mind or changing how we feel about something or changing our behavior. True transformation involves the whole person. And we are people who are made up of intellect, emotion, and will. We have an intellectual part and an emotional part and a volitional part. We have our mind, and we have our heart, and we have our body. And true transformation is what takes place when we engage all three. The Apostle Paul dedicated his life, in fact, he sacrificed his life to persuade people of the love of God. You see, for the Apostle Paul, the consummate example of the love of God was the story of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The gospel was the consummate expression of God's love. It was rational, it was emotional, it was volitional. And the Apostle Paul dedicated his life to persuading people, to seeing that spiritual transformation take place in their lives. And it was no different as he stood in the Areopagus at the intellectual center of the Western world in Athens, Greece. And as he stood and he proclaimed the gospel in Acts chapter 17, Paul gives us an argument that doesn't just aim at their minds, it also aims at their hearts. It also challenges them to live differently. You see, the Apostle Paul is not often known as an emotional leader. But if you study the writings of the Apostle Paul in the Bible, you will find that over 120 times, the Apostle Paul talks about love in his letters. And he talks about love sometimes as that understanding the idea of what unconditional love must do, what is a reasonable argument for the value of God's love. There are other times when he talks about the worship and the emotion and the experience of God's love. But often the Apostle Paul talks about the action that is identified as love. He talks about love as a verb. He talks about love as something that we do. In fact, the most famous chapter in all of the Apostle Paul's writing is sometimes called the love chapter. I have heard it read at more weddings than I care to mention. It is 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the Apostle Paul is describing the to-do list of love. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, it does not boast. Love does all of these things. Love never fails. It is the action items, the volitional expression of love. And as Paul stood in the Areopagus and made his case for the love of God, he describes it in two ways. The first idea that he proposes is that all children are in fact God's children. He says that the God who made the earth and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. And this God does not live, he doesn't dwell in your temples made of stone. He is not an idol that you can fashion with your own hands. In fact, the God that I am talking about is the God who gives us everything. He gives everyone life and breath and everything else. He gives it to all of us. All of us are a byproduct of God's love. You could say that all of us are God's kids. All of us are God's children. He goes on to say that God, from one individual, we all have the same genetic makeup. We all have the same biological legacy. And that legacy has populated the earth and gone to the ends of the earth. And God has done this so that humankind, no matter where they are on the planet, share a common identity, a common longing, a common need. And God has marked out for all of us the appointed times in our personal lives where we will live and when we will live, the boundaries of our lands. And God has done all of this, all of it, so that we might seek to have a relationship with God and that we might reach out and somehow find God, even find God, because God is not far from us. And Paul is not simply appealing to the listeners there in the Areopagus as rational beings. He's appealing to that cry of every human heart, that we long to belong, that we long to be known. And you could say that his proposal is not just that all children are God's children, but that all of us are known by God. As a parent knows their children, as a mother loves and knows her child, so we are known by God. Compared to the idols and compared to the mystery of Greek mythology, this personal idea of a personal God was a compelling argument, not just rationally, but also emotionally. The second proposition, the second idea that Paul makes suggests in his speech is that all truth is God's truth. He talks about how God is the one who gives everyone, who gives to everyone everything. Everything in the earth, life and breath, our very existence is from God. And God has given all of us a place. He has populated the earth from one man through all of the nations, and that God has marked out for us the times and the places where we should live. And God has done all of this so that we might seek truth. Because in seeking God, we are seeking truth. In seeking God, we are seeking an explanation, a reason, understanding. So when we are seeking to understand, we are seeking God. We are seeking home. We are seeking our Father. We are seeking the reason, the rationale. And God said, and Paul says, God did all of this so that we might seek that truth and perhaps reach out for that truth and find that truth. And that truth is not far from any one of us. And then he says something astonishing. He says, for in him we live and move and have our being. And he says, this is what your poets, your philosophers have said. We are his offspring. And the Apostle Paul references two ancient Greek philosophers. The first one that he references is a philosopher named EPIMENIDES. Now, scholars are not sure whether Epimenides was a fictional character, an apocryphal character, because we have no record of things that Epimenides produced himself. We only have stories from people about Epimenides. He was reported to have lived almost 700 years before Paul was standing in Athens in the Areopagus. But Paul quotes from one of the most famous poems that is attributed to Epimenides. It is called Cretia. And at the end of the stanza where Epimenides, through his character Minos, is expressing adoration for Zeus, the god of all the gods in Greek mythology. It is there in that poem that Epimenides penned the phrase, "For in him we live and move and have our being." He then quotes from ARATUS. ARATUS was an actual Greek philosopher who lived about 300 years before the time of Paul. And we have some remnants, some indication that Aratus was an actual Greek philosopher. But he wrote a poem called Phenomena. And in the 5th stanza of the poem Phenomena, he almost plagiarizes Epimenides. And he too is recording the wonder of worship of Zeus. And at the end of his reflection about how we are all embodied in the identity of Zeus, he literally says, "And we are his offspring." And the Apostle Paul quotes from the mythology of the Greek Academy and says there's truth there. There's truth in the culture, there's truth in the science, there's truth in the history, there's truth beneath the surface. It's embedded in the world that we live in. And Paul's argument is that all truth is God's truth. And the passion of it isn't that we could know the truth, but that we would know that the truth is that we can know God, because God is the truth. So when we are seeking truth, we are seeking God. See, all of this is built, I believe, on Paul's theology of love. Paul understood the gospel. Paul understood the nature of love as a refuge. And it is a tabernacle, it is a fortress, it is a temple that God provides each of us. God invites us to dwell in the safety of his love. And Paul's theology of love is built on four cornerstones. And the first one is in his argument there in the Areopagus. It is the gift of love that is creation. It is life itself. The first cornerstone of Paul's theology of love is that life itself is a gift. Life itself is God's invitation to live in his love. Now, the second cornerstone, the Athenians would have had very little idea of, and it's the cornerstone of grace. It is rooted in the story of the person of Abram. Abram, the father of the people of God, the father of the nation, is an example of grace, because Abram was a goat herder in the middle of nowhere in Ur of the Chaldees when God came to Abram and basically said, "You see the stars of the heavens? That's how many offspring you will have." And he was a childless goat herder. And he said, "I want you to relocate your life from this place that you are familiar with to a land that I will give you." And it says that Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It was by grace through faith that Abram experienced the love of God, just like we do. The third cornerstone of Paul's theology of love is the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Paul constantly refers to the law as a structure that showed us how to love God and how to love each other. That the 10 Commandments were basically an expression of the vertical expression of love and the horizontal expression of love. And as you read the Apostle Paul, he refers to the law as sort of that loving parent that guides and protects and refines God's people. And the final cornerstone is the cornerstone of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. It is the cornerstone that Isaiah predicted in Isaiah 28, that the promised Messiah would be a precious stone, a precious cornerstone, and that cornerstone would complete God's story, the incarnation, the refuge of love, and that if you hide yourself in that love, you'll be liberated from anxiety and fear. You'll be in the fortress of God's love. And in Paul's thinking, what he was saying in the Areopagus that day was a complete example of this is the love of God. We are all God's children, and all truth is God's truth. We are known by God, and we can know God. Now, I am no expert in persuasion. I don't claim to be the world's best salesman, and I really don't think this is an appropriate place to imagine that I'm selling you something. And while I am hilarious and entertaining, I understand that really the point of what our conversations are about is really transformation. And transformation does not simply take place because we make a rational argument, or because we pull at our heartstrings, or because we get to-do lists. It is the fullness of who we are, engaging in the fullness of who God is. That's why this is my apologia. This is more than rational. It's more than reason. It's more than logical. It is all that we are. And true transformation, I believe, takes place when our mind and our heart and our will are changed. I think this is what gave Bob Dylan and the musicians in the 60s so much influence. Because they gave an emotional center to the rhetoric of the day, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And for my generation, the voices of the artists and the actors and the playwrights and the poets and the singers and the musicians gave the emotional center to the life that we were trying to find our way in. That's why the music industry basically lost their collective minds when in August of 1979, Bob Dylan released a Christian evangelical record. It was called Slow Train Coming. You might remember one of the songs from Slow Train Coming called You Gotta Serve Somebody, or as Bobby would say, and I call him Bobby would say, you serve somebody. It actually won a Grammy Award for the best rock vocal performance. Bob Dylan, best rock vocal performance. And it was recorded with a young guitar player that Bob Dylan discovered named Mark Knopfler. About 10 months later, Bob Dylan recorded a second evangelical Christian album called Saved. And in August of 1981, he recorded a third Christian album called Shot of Love. I remember these albums very well because I was very young in my faith at the time. And I was really struggling to put the pieces together, to figure out how to have a genuine faith in a world of such confusion and anxiety and mystery. And I remember it was Bob Dylan. It was Bob Dylan who gave voice to that journey. I owe him a lot for that because in the young journey of my faith, Bob helped me with that transformation. There was one song in particular, it was on the second album, Saved. And it was the second side of the album. I had the actual LP. And when you turned the album over, the first cut on the second side, Bob Dylan said this: "Many try to stop me, shake me up in my mind. Say, prove to me that he is Lord. Show me a sign. What kind of sign they need when it all comes from within? When what's lost has been found and what's to come has already been. Shake the dust off of your feet. Don't look back. Nothing now can hold you down, nothing that you lack. Temptation's not an easy thing. Adam given the devil rein. Because he sinned, I got no choice. It run in my vein. But yes, I'm pressing on. Yes, I'm pressing on. Well, I'm pressing on to the higher calling of my Lord.